Right. So welcome, everyone. I think we only have 1 hour and we have so much to get through. So rather than waiting for another couple of minutes for the attendee list to populate, I think we should just get cracking. So welcome to the first in this new format by the AASA, this new webinar format by the AASA. So first things first, if you guys have, if anyone in the attendees list has any ideas for webinars that you want to present through the AASA, please feel free to make your proposal. So there's currently an open call by the AASA that invites any designers, architects, engineers, academics, practitioners, industry professionals who want to kind of engage with the public on a topic that you believe you are passionate about. We invite you to visit our website and fill out a application for a webinar proposal. The webinar proposals can be either 1, 2, or 3. So it can be a webinar series. It can be a single webinar proposal. And we've already almost have the next 4 or 5 months booked, but we are definitely thinking ahead for the future, and we very much look forward to receiving these. The best part about this is that there is an honorarium involved, which is great, which is something that is not usual these days. Right, without further ado, today's webinar is the first webinar series in this new webinar format. So this is kind of all really fresh for us. And we're very thankful for the Visualization Institute from UTS to use the AASA as a platform in which they want to discuss, which we believe is a very important topic for both professionals in the architectural discipline and non-architects. And I'm pretty sure you will appreciate the significance of this over the next hour. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Linda Matthews, who will be moderating today's event. Dr. Linda is a co-director of the Visualization Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, and she's also a senior lecturer at the university, and she's going to be walking you through today's event. So Linda, over to you, and for everyone else, welcome.
Welcome, everybody. And to start off, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're delivering this, the various lands we're delivering this webinar, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. So welcome everyone, and thank you AASA for hosting this for us. It's a great opportunity for the Visualisation Institute. And I'd just like to introduce you to some of the ideas that we're going to present over the next month. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, so here we have today's lecture, which is obviously dealing with the an historical perspective and the sorts of historical applications and their sort of impact that they've had on the way we understand our practice as architects today. And the next in the series, in a fortnight's time, will be dealing with technology, directly with studies of robotics and the sorts of absolutely contemporary types of practices and technologies that are impacting upon architecture. And finally, we will look at the actual applications of visualization within the profession itself and how these sorts of applications are used to non-visual people to help them understand the sorts of languages that architects now need to use. So as I said, today is about historical perspectives and their impact on the practices of today. But first of all, I'd like to introduce you, just talk a little bit about the Visualisation Institute itself, which is a fairly recent initiative of the university. Sorry about that. The idea of the university has decided to bring together some of the incredible expertise across all of the faculties and pull them together into a Visualisation Institute so we can actually combine our skills across all of the different faculties, bring them together and then present them to industry and all of the opportunities that are starting to emerge within industry and within the vast challenges that are presented by society today. So we undertake ambitious visualisation projects across a broad range of technologies and sectors to address industry and societal challenges. And what we offer is incredible expertise, basically, visualisation research and development to partners from a broad range of sectors. So we use hybrid approaches across the different skill sets that we have. So I just wanted to make you aware that we're starting up and that we will be continuing to grow certainly after lockdown, over the next few years. So let me introduce you to our speakers today. First, we have Professor Anthony Bourke, who is the Director of the Master's Program in the School of Architecture at UTS. Anthony is a graduate of Columbia University GSAP and is recognised internationally for his work in architectural design, curation and commentary, specialising in contemporary design theory at the intersection of technology, urbanism and practice. So Anthony's lecture today, Design by Numbers, looks at the emergence of new hybrid modes of data visualisation through an historical lens, and it poses a key disciplinary question. Now that rendering is dead, where to from here? Our second speaker today is Professor Andrew Johnston, who is co-director of the UTS Visualisation Institute and head of the Interaction Design and Games discipline in the School of Computer Science at UTS. Andrew is a researcher and an interaction software designer. His work focuses on the design of systems that support experimental, exploratory approaches to interaction and the experiences and practices of the people who use them. He conducts practice-based research in the broad area of creativity and technology. Andrew's lecture today, Digital Innovation and Creative Practice, presents a series of case studies exploring the relationships between creative practitioners and digital technologies. Each case study involves significant technical innovation, but it is only an elaborate excuse to examine and provoke human creative practices. So I'll just reiterate the program today. So we're having the introduction now. We'll do 20 minutes of lecture from each, presentation from each of the speakers, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A with the audience. So if you have any questions, can you please not enter them into the Q&A portal, but into the chat function at the foot of your screen. The webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the AASA website. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Anthony.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, AASA, and thank you, the Visualisation Institute, for the invitation to speak today and to be part of this actually amazing series. I think it sounds like actually a lot of territory is going to be covered in the next 3 sessions. So I think my role today is to help to sort of set a scene. And I've already gone off piece, and I did say that my lecture title was going to be Design by Numbers, but in thinking about it as I was putting it together, I came back to regimes of vision, old and new. And I feel like what I intend to do here, this is a knowledgeable audience I realise I'm speaking to. So trying to give a snapshot of something like 1,000 years of architectural representation in 15 minutes is probably a bit much of a stretch. So I really want to kind of try and provoke a few key thoughts around where we are with visualization in architecture today, based on some of the sort of histories that we're all relatively familiar with, and maybe a quick refresher on some points. So I want to start with the claim that the rendering is dead. Long live the rendering. So no, but the rendering is dead. I think I want to make the case that we've exhausted the idea of any kind of verisimilitude in the way that we approach rendering. Now, this has a history, of course, and it has a moment in time, but I want to make the point that this relationship that we have in architecture to where we are right now with very high-end renderings like the one that's on the screen here. This is a Doug and Wolf rendering. That's one of the practices that you'll know very well, I'm sure. But while I say the rendering is dead, actually what I really mean to say is that the audience has completely changed, and so has the function of the rendering. So we've moved into a very different space for what these kinds of images are all about, and consequently a very different kind of skill set around it. Most importantly, I suppose, is, and I will come back to this over and over again, is the idea of who is the audience? Who are we visualizing for? As a discipline, what is this as a communication strategy, and exactly who are we trying to talk to and what are we trying to say? So I think if we keep those kinds of questions in front of us, it sounds a bit obvious perhaps initially, but as we get into the more contemporary kinds of spaces of manufacturing and so on, we start to realize, I would suggest, that actually visualization these days has much less to do with human-to-human types of interactions and much more to do with humans to systems types of engagements beyond, and even beyond that. The kind of history that I think of, you know, again, trying to sort of reduce this down to something fairly coherent and quick for a talk like this one, moves through these sort of 8 points or 8 stages or thereabouts. And I want to just really quickly touch on them as a kind of a refresher and to help bring out a couple of threads that they start to suggest at each moment. The first one is Alberti. Who couldn't start there? The idea about Alberti was, and I want to tip my hat to Chris Bamborough, my PhD student, who I've been working with, or who's been working with me for a while now, who has brought this up in his PhD dissertation that's ongoing right now. But Alberti's delineation of the city of Rome back in 1450, thereabouts, was the first time where data was really central to the idea of representation. In that sense, it was a design by numbers or a representation by numbers. For him, it was a surveying technique, and I'm sure you're all aware of this experiment or this project that Alberti was, is famous for doing. But I think the point about this that I really wanted to drive home is not to remind you of that so much, but to sort of that quote that's there on the screen that you can see now. Even a man endowed with an average intellect can map the city of Rome. So the intent behind the data and the data visualization, turning data into some kind of visual register, was so that, and it was created so that it could be done by any person. This kind of open access and open egalitarianism around the data representation and visualization spatial continuum, if I could put it that way, was the ambition of this project. I think that's worth reminding ourselves of, because that gets to audience, it gets to technique, and it actually sort of says that from the very earliest moments in architectural thinking around these kinds of questions, we really have a very broadly ambitious idea of who the audience is. And even to the point where actually we're not developing visualizations as such, we're really developing visualization tools to give to people to use in their own way. So we all become visualizers. It's a bit like Clay Shirky's commentary about we're all producers now in a media context. Even, just because of our social media feeds, we're all producers. So that is an ambition for Alberti. I think is one of the most interesting parts of that project, apart from, there was the mathematics of it all. But really that ambition there was significant. We'll get back to that, I think. The next stage in this little quick chronology gets us to around the Beaux-Arts, and I think of Durand when I go there. This actually is a little bit later. This is an American, Henry McGoodwin, who was using techniques like those developed in the Beaux-Arts to draw and document. In Henry's case, in particular, it was the calculation of exact shadows on complex objects. And the idea that mathematics and data was there to project three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional plane in new and more deep and elaborate ways. The thing I like about these drawings is that they are both figural and technical. And if we look at, and I don't have a slide here, but if we look at the portfolios, for example, of the students of Durand and the Beaux-Arts back in the day, we're talking about ink renderings on vellum or on parchment that might be 17, 18, 19 layers of ink washes to create a kind of a layered drawing that, on the one hand, is incredibly directly related to an art practice. On the other hand, it is this kind of embedding of technical information into this visually rich regime that the Beaux-Arts is all about. The kinds of things they were drawing back then included drawings like this one, column, capital, and base, but also things like fortifications for medieval structures throughout Europe. So along with that, we see not just like a painting of a building, something like a Turner or something that we might expect, but we start to see the numerical interface or the numerical layer of technical draftsmanship coming on top of this very painterly approach to visualization. So here we have a really interesting kind of layering going on. And I think this does start to set up a dichotomy which follows through actually in visualization from here on in. A quick pit stop in the sort of the early 20th century as we got into, Neufert and things like the evolution of the Geometric Handbook ultimately. And this is the quantification of the human body and everything about the human environment, the built environment. At this point, we start seeing by numbers. We stop seeing, mise en scene. We stop seeing kind of depth and color and quality in space so much as we start seeing quantity. And the idea of quantity making itself apparent in visualization was both, very directly, obviously, related to the modernist project and connection to industry, an idea of efficiency, but it also gets back to the idea of how do we get in touch with the every person, the everyman, whereas sort of like the abstract bottom line that is universally interpretable or understandable. So there is, again, that bigger ambition here for this kind of work. Now, it has its problems. It certainly has its problems. I mean, goodness gracious, let's not get into sort of the discussion about what the ideal person is. And we know some of the origins of that history are being incredibly problematic. However, I think from a visualization perspective, this idea where architecture, in a wholesale way, really bought into the idea that there's this sort of numerical abstraction which underlays everything that we start to understand as a technical discipline, was now part of the visual register. In fact, it was not just what we were drawing, but it was how we were drawing. Brings me to this chap, Jay Forrester, who's one of my sort of favourites. And I wrote about Jay like he's my buddy. I wrote about Mr. Forrester, Dr. Forrester, like he was, back in my writing about networks. And that's because Jay Forrester was the developer really of systems theory and then ultimately urban dynamics. This was happening in the late 60s, early 70s. Actually, even a smidge earlier than that, Jay was interested in this idea that he could see from his perspective the networked connections, interrelations of things around us. He starts from a kind of a sales and business management point of view, and that's where his kind of home ground is, the systems management perspective. But then he kind of zooms out and starts to think, actually, our entire human ecology can be represented by these networks of interrelations and relationships. So he needs, of course, to find a way to communicate that, to represent that, and in some ways to chart and forecast those kinds of calculations that he's doing in the background. So there he is sitting in the MIT Digital Computer Lab, surrounded by an old-fashioned computer that he's actually sitting in. And I think what's interesting about this was, there are heaps of things interesting about this, but for our visualization conversation, what's interesting here is he wasn't an architect, but he had no compunction about the idea that, for example, he could take old computers from the NASA program and bring them to Chicago and tell the mayor of Chicago that he could, with all hand-on-heart confidence, actually chart and map and predict all the urban behaviour of a metropolis like Chicago and make it run more efficiently and more optimally for a better human outcome. So, I mean, the confidence trick behind that is pretty impressive. But I think, for us, what that is doing is it's actually mapping the data sort of registration and the way of thinking about things into our urban environments, into our spatial imagination. Really, as I said, Jay wasn't interested in drawing pictures of urbanity. He wasn't interested in overlaying maps of urban spaces. What he was interested in these kinds of, was these kinds of graphs that you see here on the top right of the screen, where he could use these as predictive types of moments. Now, just a little segue here. I know I haven't got much time, but a little segue here. The idea of SimCity, which was developed by Will Wright, followed on very directly from this urban dynamics conversation that Jay Forrester was promoting at the time. So it did have a kind of a planar or a plan-oriented outcome ultimately, and we all know SimCity, and we all know what that's all about. But from my point of view, what is going on here is that it's a very a very compelling, from an external point of view, a very compelling connection here between dynamic systems theory thinking, systems thinking in a seriously scientific kind of way, and its intersection with architecture and design. We started then, as a consequence, we started to see the environment around us quite differently. Now, this is a little later than the earliest cybernetic turn, which happened in the sort of the 50s, as we kind of went post-war and started getting into the Cold War and those kinds of moments. And there's an amazingly rich history there. But I think from our point of view, what's happening here is that we're starting to see the world from the point of view of abstractions of numbers and graphs, rather than the idea of pictorial representations of streets and streetscapes. And Jay Forrest's work just cannot be, I don't think he's been well documented in architectural circles as much as he should for the contribution that he's made to that particular turn. So a little bit of a diversion now. 10 years later, we get something like this. So you all recognise their voluntary prisoners and Koolhauses and Tengelis here and their, their AA project. This is where visualization actually takes a sort of a sidestep. We're in the 70s. We've gone through the 60s with all the social situations of the 60s and uprisings and so on. And so while Jay Forrester, on the one hand, is promoting the cybernetic view of the world, and that is hitting up against a lot of interest in government, in industry, and so on the other hand, the rearguard, or the antithesis of that, if you like, is represented, I think, by these kinds of drawings, which were going gangbusters. So, we had ArchiZoom, we had Super Studio, and the likes. The reason I put this on the screen is I think that this does sort of really highlight this dichotomy we had between the polemical drawing, the ideologically loaded propaganda of the architectural visualization that we see here in Koolhaus, politically loaded and all that kind of stuff, versus the kind of image of Jay Forrest's graph on the other hand. And those two things somehow sitting incredibly uncomfortably next to each other through this period of the late 60s through to really the 2000s, actually. And so you have two streams of thought working over each other. They never really, at least in my mind, they never really got together. They never went on a date and found kind of common ground. They were always representing two very different polarities within the architectural discourses that we all came through the university with. That gets us to this kind of stuff, from the late 90s into the early 2000s, where we did find something of a representational turn in a quantitative regime, if I could put it that way. So the diagramming discourse that was happening around Foreign Office, and then the whole troupe of digital architects that came up at that time, Eisenmans and Liebeskind and the rest. What's going on there is actually an appropriation of Forrester's language into a highly representational and interpretive realm. So while we look at this, these are just sort of samples of the work of that period. While we look at something like the Foreign Office, graph there, yes, it has immediate relationships to, a network input-output sort of graph or a flowchart. So the correlation between those two things is very evident. The hidden message, well, maybe the not so hidden message here is that there is an authority to this drawing because it borrows from the visualization techniques of systems management and the cybernetic world that it's proclaiming to come from. In that authority, they can make claims about radical architectural difference. The Eisenman version, which is the example of the meshes on the right there, that's from the Staten Island project in 2001. It borrows again from that legitimacy of the digital abstraction of data and quantity. But really what's going on here is an incredibly free-flowing, interpretive and sculptural space. So the discourse is all up here about authority and decision-making and data-driven decisions and all that. Actually, what's happening is it's sort of a proxy really for a different kind of interpretive turn in architecture. So visualization was the crux of this. We've read a lot about the diagram, diaries and all the rest. Again, we know that this was a moment of importance. I think what we haven't really come to terms with even now is that there were these two conflicting regimes sort of wrestling at this point in a mesh drawing like this one from Eisenman. That brings me to a now moment, and I think I found this slide, another Doug and Wolf rendering from Crofi, actually, from a Sydney practice, excellent. And so a recent rendering. And it kind of, when I saw this, I mean, I was really struck. And I suppose I'm trying to find here, I want to see this image as something which is new. It's not the rendering that I talk about when we think about real estate architects doing kind of commercially driven renderings for sale and domain on the weekend. It's not the kind of rendering that is the idea of the photorealism of the unbuilt building in place. So that sort of a similitude actually is not the aim here. When we look at this kind of drawing or this sort of image, really what we're seeing is a highly emotional atmosphere here. So the role of the rendering in that context, it's moved completely away from actually describing anything like a reality, quote unquote, into something which is all atmosphere. It is all emotion. And we know in the background, of course, it's all data driven and it's all, it's from the kind of the latest rendering and light engines and all the rest of it. And to some degree, that's become fundamentally uninteresting, I think, to architects. I don't really care anymore about what software you're using. Completely agnostic about that. But what I think is really interesting here is that we've actually deprioritized the architecture itself to a point where we're basically using renderings now in such an amazingly painterly way that they are inhabiting this end of the spectrum for visualization, which has become, I would say, almost 100% emotive. Yeah, sure, there's a polemical kind of side to this, political side. You can't put Tatlin's Tower in the middle of a rendering like this and think it's not somehow political or very knowing of what it's doing. But look at the architecture. It's effectively evaporated. It's almost disappeared in the whiteness around that centerpiece. So that's that kind of very quick sort of snapshot of history. I do want to just make a couple of quick points. Firstly, what has changed? Perhaps it's not about the visualization itself that we really need to be talking about, but really who is the audience that we're now communicating with? That is the major change that's happened, I think, in the last 30 years of issues around visualization. And so in that sense, it's not just human to human, which is really our departure point. Certainly that human to human is all the nostalgia and romance of drawing in architecture and that form of visualization. But I think we'd be foolish not to recognize that we are now sort of embedded in systems which are human to machine, machine back to human, and machine to machine. So within that register, architecture itself as a process has wholesale moved. Whether you feel romantic about that or not, or optimistic about that or not, it really has, the process has moved into a very different space. The actors, the stakeholders in that endeavor are fundamentally different, meaning we're dealing with the systems directly. Systems are dealing with systems directly, and we know where that kind of goes from, from the kind of technology point of view. From a visualization point of view, it does beg the question about actually where is our role as human perceivers in all of this? Where does our role get marginalized actually in a lot of the sort of manufacturing and ultimately analytical work that's going on in the background? Keeping us in the loop is going to be an interesting question for the visualization side of it. Otherwise, from machine to machine, really, it's a sort of a feed of data, so it doesn't need the visualization as such. So what does visualization actually offer a machine in that sense? These are the kind of points in this little quick potted history that I think really speak to that particular turn very, very directly. And that is the idea that data has always been there in our discourse as architects, but it's now become not just an idea or not just an abstraction. It's become effectively an atmosphere or a material that we are grappling to work with. So that is the change that we're navigating at this point. And I put this, I think, this great sort of network diagram in the background here from Lombardi, whose work I love and always loved as an artist, who saw the world in these connections and has seen in his art practice from very early on. Drawings like this then are very familiar to us, and this is sort of the stuff of the contemporary architectural studio. So we're not drawing here for spatial purposes as much as, or that's not quite true. We're not really drawing here to try and capture spatial ambience as such. We're really trying to find a way to reconcile a new regime of data over the built environment and prioritize that regime of data. The data itself is so complex. There are so many different ways in which it comes to play in architecture, which we all recognize. But this is the dominant, becomes the focus now of the way in which we as architects need to navigate the practice or the discipline that we're actually working in. I would make the case too that, we're also we've been trained to do this outside of our discipline as a larger public audience, and we've been going through that process at least since the 60s. So when I sort of show you these graphs, these are just from the current news cycle. You've got the climate change report up on the top left there. You've got the stock exchange from yesterday. You've got the rise in average home loan rates down there on the bottom left, and you've got COVID cases on the bottom right. So these are the topics of the day. This is the world as it is represented back to us these days, visualized, if you like, back to us as an audience across issues which are much bigger than just architecture. So we as an audience are now well trained in this, or we are becoming even better trained in this sort of form of abstraction. Recognizing this change that we're going through actually opens up a kind of an opportunity for us then as architects to sort of get into this space in our own terms. Last point to make is really just when we start to get into that kind of space, really some of the research that's going on right now in things like machine visualization or AI visualization is really interesting. This is just one paper that I came across recently that sort of talks about human attention being fundamentally different to machine attention when analyzing an image. What that means is the way that we see the world as humans and the way that an AI sees the world as an artificial intelligence working on a data set are fundamentally different. The overlap is sort of 0.2 out of 100%. So, sorry, 20% out of 100%. So we only see 20% of the same thing. So if the world is being given back to us, if you like, through things like drones, through visualizations that are coming from all sorts of sensing apparatus, the recognition here that we are seeing the world very differently between these two edges, I think, is really interesting to contemplate and a really interesting one for us as architects. So somewhere in this all, we're sitting on this spectrum now between the informatic, which is the sort of situation I just described, and the emotive polemical, on the other hand. Both are not going away, but I think both have become so perhaps detached from each other. It's really interesting to see how we might find common ground again there through architecture. So some thoughts for you all. I hope that's been useful, and I really welcome the conversation to come. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Anthony. That was fantastic. Super interesting. I have about 20 questions of my own. So unfortunately, we won't have time for all of those 20 questions, but hopefully everyone else will. Andrew, I'll ask you to present now. Thank you, Anthony. That was great.
Great. Thanks, Linda, and thanks, Anthony. Yeah, really fascinating talk. Thank you so much. So I'm not sure if my talk really follows on in a very logical way from Anthony's. So just let me make this full screen. What I'm going to talk about is digital innovation and creative practice. So, Anthony was in a way talking about visualization and the purpose of visualization and focusing on the human side of visualizations and the purpose of them. So what I'm looking at, digital innovation and creative practice, I'm going to present a few case studies where I'm presenting work that we've done at the Animal Logic Academy and the Visualisation Institute, creating new technologies and deploying them in different contexts and looking at the relationships between the people that are in those contexts and in particular their real world practice, often their creative practice in the case of arts and live performance companies. However, I did realise that the theme for today was the historical use of data visualization. I thought I should give a little history of data visualization, but I'm realising really Anthony's covered that so much more thoroughly. I'll refer to this book that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Tufte's book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. It's a go-to reference that shows so many sort of classic data visualizations. I feel like I'm probably singing to the choir here that everyone already knows this. Without being in a physical room with you all, it's hard to say, can I have a show of hands? But I'm sure many of you at least would be aware of John Snow's visualization of cholera deaths in London from 1854, where he basically visualized the deaths in a neighbourhood in a particular part of London, and he superimposed that visualization over the map. He superimposed the deaths of the cholera death data on the map, and alongside the locations of particular water pumps that people used for their drinking water. And through doing that, was able to sort of quickly see that there was a pump that was contaminated, and that was causing a lot of the cholera cases. Likewise, this is another classic data visualization of from Charles Minard, visualizing Napoleon's army's ill-fated campaign in Russia in 1812. And as again, as you're probably aware, but it shows the thickness of the line here shows the numbers of troops in Napoleon's army. And as Napoleon marches towards Moscow, you can see the thickness of that line getting reduced, indicating that the size of the army is getting whittled down as they're attacked at various points. And then you can see their retreat from Moscow, which is the black line down the bottom. And what he includes in this wonderful chart is not just the troop numbers, but also things like down the bottom. I hope you can see my mouse pointer down the bottom here where I'm pointing. The temperature, and as you can see, the temperature dropping down to minus 30 degrees Celsius as they're getting closer and closer to the end of their campaign. So it's a very dramatic visualization and a very classic data visualization, just showing, using data to tell a very horrific, horrible, but also compelling sort of story. Likewise, Florence Nightingale is also well known for creating these diagrams called rose diagrams that she used to show the causes of deaths in the army in the 1850s, which she basically used to help convey the message that more soldiers were dying of infection and malnutrition and so on than from actual battlefield deaths. So without, so what I'm trying to do here is sort of paint a picture of, there is a long history of visualization. Anthony's already talked about that. And in recent years, there's been an explosion of data visualizations using digital technologies. There's some great websites out there that I'm sure many of you have looked at over the years that have really good examples of these. And, COVID has been also a real boon for data visualization. As you can see that, news sites and so on are increasingly incorporating quite sophisticated narrative-driven approaches to data visualization in the stories that they're presenting to the public. However, in the kind of work that I do in the Animal Logic Academy at UTS, and that a number of us are doing in the Data Visualization Institute, is we're taking a much broader view of data visualization. We're thinking beyond graphs and beyond sort of one-to-one representations of numbers to visuals. And we're increasingly thinking of data visualization really as the visualization gets put in inverted commas, and we're thinking about translating data, translating numbers into a form that people can perceive. So that can include, of course, it can include visual things, it can include animations on a screen, it can include things that are tangible. You can fabricate, you can translate digital data into using 3D printing and so on. You can translate digital data into something that has physical form beyond photons. You can translate it into sound. You can translate it into smells. So I'm interested in a much more broad view of what data visualization is, in translating into something that people can perceive and also interact with. And what's implied in that, of course, as well, is we're interested in translating things that are perceivable into data, because that's an obviously critical step that I guess in many ways often gets neglected, that the step from real world to data is a very fraught one, and can have baked into it, if it's not done thoughtfully, a lot of negative connotations. So getting down to my sort of specific work in the Animal Logic Academy, and also in another group that I'm involved with, the Creativity and Cognition Studios at UTS, putting it very broadly, the kinds of themes we're working in, we're looking at human-centered design. So with everything that we do, with every kind of innovative piece of technology we deploy, and I'll talk about what those are in another slide or two, with every piece of technology we deploy, we're interested in it not for the sake of the technology. We're in an engineering and IT faculty, so I feel like I always need to say that. We're interested in technology, and we like the possibilities that it brings us, but we're not into it for its own sake. We're interested in it for what it can bring to people and what people can do with it, and how it can change the way they think, and maybe change the things that they do and discuss. So human-centered design is a key theme for us. From a technical point of view, the things we can do is we know about animation, we know about visual effects, we know about sound, and we know about interaction design. We're also interested in storytelling data and immersive technologies, and the dialogue, and this is quite critical, the dialogue between technology and real-world practice. If we create some kind of innovative technology for use on the stage, for example, and a dance company uses that technology, how does that technology change their creative practice? How does the creative practice change the technology? How do people misappropriate and misuse the technology to explore it and sort of get something really worthwhile for them out of it? So with that background, I'm now going to jump into a couple of case studies, and I can basically talk for as long as there is time. So I'm kind of quite keen to allow at least 15 minutes for discussion, and I see we're already closing in on 2:45. So the first case study I'll talk about is a collaboration I've had going for a number of years with a dance and physical theatre company called Stalker Theatre. And as part of this collaboration, we have created a number of interactive projection systems for use in live dance performance. And I'll just take my slide off and I'll jump into a video, and maybe I'll play a video while I talk over it. I'm just going to turn the sound down. The sound is great, but I will turn it off. So what you're hopefully seeing here is this is a work that we created in 2016, 2017 with Stalker Creature, Dot and the Kangaroo. So it's a retelling of the sort of, I guess, old Australian story of Dot and the Kangaroo, a young girl who gets lost in the Australian bush. And as you can hopefully see here, we created an interactive system that tracks the movements of the dance performers on the stage, captures it, obviously in digital form, and then feeds that movement data into interactive graphics that are shown on stage with the performers. So the process is all about collaboratively working with Stalker and working with the performers to create these interactive systems. We work very much as part of the creative team. It's not the case that we go to them with the technology and say, boom, here it is, knock yourself out. We're working with them as digital artists to create this work. So we create the work. Our research, what we do for our research is interview the performers. We reflect on our engagement with them. We interview performers. We conduct focus groups with them. We interview people from across the spectrum of the company, the CEO, the lighting artists, the musicians, the composer, etc., to try and get a sense of how is the way they're thinking about creating this work different to other works where they don't have interactive technology in the room. So we're really trying to close the gap. We're really trying to understand how this innovative approach to visualization, which is highly interactive, how it changes their creative practices. Another project that I'll talk about before I wrap up, I've got about 1 more minute, I'm aware. So this is, I have a number in the creative space, but I have another project which is perhaps a bit more prosaic, or a bit more, not in the creative area, I suppose. This is a collaboration we have with a company that makes software for field technicians, and we're exploring the potential of augmented reality for these field technicians to see how they might use it to do their job more safely and more effectively. So what you're seeing here is a prototype application we developed that allowed field technicians, when they first arrived on site for a job that they had to work on, the very first thing they're supposed to do when they arrive on site, and I'm sure as architects you'll be well aware of this, is they need to do a check of all the safety hazards that might be around. In the analog world, we found that the way they manage those safety hazards on a number of these sites is they have a whiteboard with the hazards notated on them, but often the whiteboard is on like in a building that's on the far corner of the site or something, or it's in a position where the field technicians have to walk past a bunch of hazards in order to see the list of hazards. So we thought the augmented reality could be a more efficient way of demonstrating to them information about the hazards, actually superimposed over their view of the real world as they're looking around when they first arrive on site. And we developed a whole series of these prototypes for different kinds of field technicians. These ones were for lift technicians, and this allowed them to log the work that they did on the various bits of machinery they were working on, take photos of the work that they've done to document it properly, and then also associate, like physically locate those logs on the actual pieces of equipment that the work was completed on. So again, it's about really working to understand the context that the technicians are working in, then crafting prototypes collaboratively with them to address issues that arise, and then closing the loop by evaluating the prototypes and getting their feedback on what is it actually like to use these things, what are the possibilities for it, how does it change the way you think about doing your job. So beyond just efficiency, how is it sort of tweaking your perceptions about what you're doing and how you might approach your job and how you might approach collaborating with others, which is quite an important thing. I am mindful of time. I have like at least another 65 slides that I could go through and some other very cool case studies that I would love to talk about. But hopefully there's enough there to give you a flavour of the kind of the way that we work and some of the innovations we do. I'm not very clear on what the connection with architecture is, to be honest, but I do feel somewhat intuitively that there may be many, and I'm very interested to hear if you see any. So I think with that, I'll throw back to Linda, who can open up for questions.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really fascinating and unfortunately cut short. There's a lot to ask about all of that. I'll open up the chat room to people to respond. I can't see any questions at the moment, but please feel free to start generating questions to those two fabulous lectures. I have one myself to kick off because I'm going to take advantage of the space. Anthony, you were talking about mapping data into space, and that's part of the architectural process of visualization, but it's been done for centuries. I'm particularly interested in this, of course, but when we think about linear perspective and how it got mapped into space through surveying instruments effectively and then started to formalise itself in cities like Genoa and places like that. So you actually get the embedding of those geometries within the formal spaces of the city. What do you think in terms of the sorts of instruments that we have with the digital visualisation tools available to us? What are the sorts of formal translations, architectural translations of digital data into urban space that, I mean, I could probably sort of add to some of this myself, but I would be really interested to hear what your thoughts are, and I'm sure we all would, on what those manifestations might be.
Well, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts, Linda, on this. But I think the recognition that the way we represent the world actually ends up becomes part of the manifestation of the world itself. So these things are not detached. You know, our visual regimes create our spatial imaginations. Our spatial imaginations then become our design desires, if I can put it that way, or our mores or our responses, and therefore they become materialized. So I think even if we want to try and pretend that there's this big separation going on, there is a link, and it's not that sort of many degrees of separation between the way we draw, the way we visualize, to the things that we actually want to build. I think, you know, probably the intellectually lazy way to think about that is to sort of just think about science fiction films and how they've always been sort of Hollywood's given us the roadmap for the future. And if you look at the kind of state of architecture, especially in the 2000s, the leaning heavily on that kind of visualization was very evident. And some of the buildings like Foreign Offices, Yokohama Port Terminal, for example, were pretty directly tied to that kind of language, that kind of imagination, which came out of that sort of technical space of Hollywood, but also driven by renderings and so on. So I think now, again, 20 years later, where we are, as we start thinking about things like, LiDAR and these kinds of point cloud arrangements and any kind of, number of autonomous sensing systems, what actually gets me really interested here is that there are so many technologies of visualization out there now that are potentials for architecture. The real issue is for us, I think, editing and being clever about understanding what is significant and what is not. And when I say that, I mean, to know that it's a certain temperature in that corner of the room because it's shown on some kind of mapping software, or to know that, behind the walls over there on my right-hand side, there's a sort of a duct which is pumping so much air at a sort of cubic meters per second. I think this information is available to us, so this living, breathing organism of architecture around us is now available to us in ways that it's never been before. So I think that's the first thing. We haven't really, outside of the sort of technical delivery of architecture, really found a way, I think, to embrace that from a design perspective. So that's one thing. But I think the other thing too is that, as the technologies will keep just evolving and the amount of information coming to us keeps building, this separation that I'm sort of speculating on about the emotive side versus the technical side, those things are going to be even more and more, those edges are going to be more and more fraught. And I will find ways, I think, to sort of come together, that discourse will happen. And I don't think we're anywhere near that yet. I'm particularly worried about machine-to-machine representation, or that question of why bother visualizing if you are a machine. But if our builder, I always remember, sorry, I'm digressing here. I remember looking at one thing when I was doing the network stuff about a self-healing minefield, which was simply landmines in a war situation that knew where each other were, and they could actually adjust their position if one of them blew up, so that there would be a complete field of coverage for a landmine field. And I thought, terrifying stuff. But if from the point of view of understanding that as a visual regime of the landscape around us and how it can self-correct, if I could put it that way, or self-adjust, I think there's some really profound things that we as architects need to sort of start getting more involved with, so we can be a stakeholder in that.
Exactly. And then there's the whole idea of the distributed view that we have of cities, as you saw in the Cool House image that you were showing us. We do have a comment from Alex Munt. I like this idea about the evaporation of architecture. What is at stake for architecture here, for evaporation?
Is that for me? That'll be for me, I guess.
Yeah, it is.
The evaporation, so that's in the chat, is it? I'm going to pull up the chat. I've got the Q&A open.
Yeah. Well, there's one in Q&A.
Sorry, I'm just moving around my screens here. Oh, there we go. Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, I guess the idea of the evaporation in that context of the rendering I was showing was just to talk about architecture becoming all atmosphere. In that particular mode, and this is not a generalizable comment as such, but it's really the way that that particular approach to visualization, renderings, I think it's gone through this kind of big arc from photorealism and verisimilitude, if I put it that way, to this moment now where it's so significantly more painterly that, if I look at that rendering that I showed with Tatlin's Tower in the middle and compared it to a Turner's watercolor of Venice from, 1900 or something, then, they're operating in the same space. Now, this is really interesting because it means the audience appetite for this kind of conversation is being re-energized. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about in this very highly technical space. Suddenly we're back to this sort of very qualitative, emotional idea. And I think actually, and that came out in the examples that Andrew, you showed, I think, with Stroker, was it? Or the dance company?
Stalker Theatre, yeah.
Stalker Theatre, beg your pardon. Beautiful, and the emotional content of that's being rendered somehow in new forms. I think that's so elegant. And I think that has enormous potential for us. So architecture can recede in favour of that. That's the significance of that particular rendering. But I'd hand over to Andrew and just say, I think that emotional side of it is a really powerful one.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said then reminded me as well of I have a student who's working on style transfer. So for images, very simply, this is where you can take an image, you take a Van Gogh painting and another image, and you can say, re-render this image in the style of Van Gogh. That's the kind of, at a party level, what it does. But what it makes it easy is to produce a whole range of various approaches and various styles and variations, so on, of a painting, which I could imagine is perhaps a little bit what you're getting at there with architecture. Using machine learning to stimulate new ideas.
Yes.
Hope that answers the question.
Andrew, I just had a question that occurred to me when you were presenting too that I wouldn't mind asking, and it sort of has to do with what we've just been talking about. When it's a sort of about a needs, what are you actually designing something for? And then in terms of the stalker, if there's a sort of more sensitive area of maybe Indigenous content, does the visualization sometimes overinterpret that work, or how do you manage to not sort of contaminate or to sort of actually affect the outcome with your own biases, I suppose is what I'm asking, because data does have embedded biases, I imagine.
Yeah, well, I think we want to impact, we want to buy, we want to. We're artists, so we're not. I don't think there's any neutral way we can participate. If by participating in the creative work, we're bringing our own biases and our own opinions and so on to it. So we're not trying to take the data from the movement of the performers and unambiguously translate it into something visual. We recognise that we're working with them as partners, almost like, just the way a musician would or something like that, to create music to accompany the movement. We're creating visuals to accompany the movement.
Yeah.
And we're also, in a way, creating a kind of instrument for them to play with through their bodies. By moving their bodies, they're creating visuals. So all of that is non-neutral, and that's fine. I mean, you can do it badly or you can do it well.
Yeah.
And you can certainly, if it is done badly, then it can be ham-fisted, and you can, insult people or get in the way of the performance. But that's part of the art and the craft of it, I suppose. Does that actually answer what you were asking?
Yeah, totally. It totally does. I've just seen a flood of questions, so I'm going to start directing them very quickly to you both. What do you both think about the idea that rendering, such as in the Doug and Wolf Profi image, that has been reduced to composition, similar to Russian constructivists, where material is abstracted to bring out the atmospheric effects of the geometry of architecture? In my opinion, this trend in rendering has become very repetitive and formulaic. Do you think this trend is real, and how do you think we can move forward from renderings being reduced to pure composition?
Shall I take that one?
Yes.
I do agree that I think the renderings that we're talking about here are incredibly repetitive, and that's why I suggest that at the very top slide there that they've lost their authority. They have gone through a moment of being so easy to produce and so ubiquitous that actually they stop to mean anything anymore. What I'm trying to point out, though, and what I think this particular rendering struck me by, and it's interesting that we came back to this one, is this idea, and the question, links back to the constructivism that's in the centre of the Chatlands Tower there. The constructivists and that period were all about agitprop, and they were all about the political message and the ideology of it. So they were incredibly pointed. In every graphic that was constructed there was an explicit, political message going on. I think the difference between that moment and where we are now is this turn towards atmosphere that I don't quite know how to encapsulate properly, but I do think it is different to that political side. I think these kind of renderings, if any image is politically agnostic, then I think we're in that kind of space. And, no image is politically agnostic, but in the sense that the political message is not as pronounced as something like the constructivism that's going on, there's a difference here. I think the fact that the architecture has been removed from the scene effectively, has been dissolved, could be seen as a commentary on all sorts of things, from climate change and material practices to the human condition and social justice. There are all sorts of ways to read that term. But the fact that the fabric has become spatially aerosol is quite amazing. So there is a change, and that's what I'm interested in here. So I'm agreeing with the questioner there that, I think I see my first and second year students who can produce not quite as beautiful as the Doug and Wolf one, but certainly amazing renderings, within a very short period of learning. So there is a ubiquity to it, which makes it sort of very dangerously uninteresting. But there's something else going on, and I think that's what we've got to try and, wrestle with.
Yeah, that happens with all digital tools. That and it's the same with, I can see with dance works and things like that. That is something we talked about with the performers, that there are certain ubiquitous sort of approaches that come back over and over again. Fluid simulations are one of them. Particle systems and so on, and they come back and they're reused. And when they're perhaps initially used, they have a particular impact. But with the reuse, they become formulaic and so on, and so the meaning becomes dispersed over time. On the other hand, there are traditions in theatre like masking and stock characters, like the witty acrobat and the pompous doctor and so on, that are archetypes and valuable archetypes in a way, and they can be composed to create all kinds of new stories over and over again. So it's interesting. There's a bit of a tension there, I think, between the danger of the formulaic as opposed to the usefulness of some archetypes. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to run through some more questions. Mohammed, can you let me know if we have time to cover off most of these?
I don't think, I'm not sure where Mohammed is. This is Martha. I think we can do probably another 2 questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, my mic wasn't working for some reason. Agreed with Martha. I think if the panelists are okay for another 5 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes, that'd be great. Because the questions are flooding in.
Questions are really paragraphs.
And I think one of the nicest things about these webinars is that it challenges the panelists more than they anticipated they were going to be challenged, which is good. It's kind of put them on their edge. Anyway,
I'll just So starting from the bottom up, and I'll curate it a little bit. Amazing lecture. I would like to know about your thoughts about how data can be used to advantage to make a client understand who is alien to the thought, sorry, a bit strange, to the thought put behind composition of render or visual. So I guess it's sort of, the sense of that is, how can you, surely that's manipulating the image is what that question is asking.
It's the scenario in my mind when I think I understand where the question is coming from is how does the data sort of legitimate the rendering in a way? The scenario in my mind is there a moment in time when you as the architect is sitting there with your client, on their home renovation project, and rather than looking at drawings, you're looking at a set of data sheets or reports or graphs. And this becomes the representation of the spatial envelope that we're talking about designing for this project. Do we become more interested, for example, in the, say, environmental performance of the building to such a degree that those kinds of visualizations overwhelm the traditional drawings of architecture? And therefore, we start allowing ourselves to design and operate within those visual realms far more directly, maybe in a more biased way. They're not a support act any longer. They become more central to the design discussion going on. I'm sort of casting it out there a bit, but certainly if we take that thread of the histories that I was sort of trying to sort of quickly sketch, that seems to be the implication, that we continually sort of de-image the architecture in favour of re-imaging with the data. And that is that kind of, big turn, I think, that we're currently working with. If you're in an office, working in an office in architecture right now, and you're working on any building of any scale, you're genuinely, your drawing set is really only a placeholder for all of the BIM information that fits around that drawing. So it is only really an index of all the other data sets which are sort of filtering over it. So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And it gets back to Linda's comment earlier about how you see architecture and how that imagination is created through these kinds of visualization regimes is how we start actually designing the world around us and responding to it. So it's pretty important.
It is. And I'll just do one final question, and it is to Anthony. What are the key operations and tactics of spatial mapping, and how can it be used to amplify the relationality of historical narratives? This is an open-ended question. Just want to get your expert perspective on this. This is from Van.
Thanks, Van. I found myself perhaps more recently really trying to not make the case that there's this history that happened and we've got to kind of document it, and then there's this future that we design towards. Actually, if anything, kind of reading from Italian philosophy at the moment is around the idea that the future was this thing that we invented at the beginning of the modern century, and it was a really great idea at the time, but now it's completely defunct. The idea of having a future out there that we're all designing to, some utopian next or bigger than now moment, is no longer the aim. You think about climate change and these big existential threats, and you understand what I mean. The future is over. Of course, we've had that from people like Eisenman in the past. So we've always talked about the end as the beginning. So there's an interesting kind of going on there. But the idea of spatial mapping, I think that's where that kind of connection between something like a historical narrative versus, and a technology, a digital technology, is something which is really fantastic to try and bring together. I'd love to see a kind of a rendering of, let's say, across Europe, that Napoleon's army that Andrew showed us, the diagram of. Imagine taking that trip across Europe and seeing that somehow rendered in the landscape through some technology that brings that kind of story to life in a way. And these are the intersections that I think are really, they're not contradictory. They are really excitingly, potentially rich, I think.
Yes.
I hope that answers your question, Ben.
There are a few more questions, but I think we're going to have to draw it to a close, unfortunately. We're 7 minutes over time. And Mohammed and Martha, just thank you again for the opportunity. We obviously could talk for another hour. And thanks so much, Anthony and Andrew. That was absolutely super stimulating. So,
Pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. For those of you who are in attendance today, I'm just going to share my screen for a brief second. Today's webinar will be uploaded to the AASA website, so please keep an eye out for that. And we invite you to join the next webinar in this series. The date of that is the 15th of October, same time, same place, same registration link, and that will look at technology and its role in visualization. And that's basically it. Thanks very much for the tremendous talk, and I hope this is well, from what we've seen so far, this is an excellent start to this new AASA webinar format. So we really am very grateful.
yes.
Thanks for everyone, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.